Well, hello to all of you here at the beginning of week 2. I want to thank you for a great set of discussions this first week. I think we're off to a roaring start. Some really insightful engagement, both with the Old Testament text that we read, as well as the whole Gospel of Matthew, especially the genealogy. Some good interaction, I think, as well with the secondary reading and with one another. So I'm really pleased with how we're starting off for the course. And I want to thank you both for the content and the tone. You know, it's not always easy to find a tone of discussion that is both constructive and critical, you know, that is intellectually demanding, hopefully, helping us to grow, but also trying to be charitable and hear one another graciously. So let's keep that good tone going, and that provides room for healthy criticism and questioning that we also really need. So really appreciate that. Thank you, and keep it coming. I want to use this intro video primarily to talk about sort of the direction our course is going to take in terms of engaging the narrative now carefully, stage by stage, and also a key issue that has arisen in this first week. Several of us have been discussing it in the forums. I want to elaborate on it. It's this tendency to read the Bible, or Matthew specifically, as if its point were to distinguish between the good guys and the bad guys, and to make us feel better about being the good guys. In the course of doing that, I also am going to say a word about youth ministry. I know many of us are working with young people, and I think there's some insight to gain from how we handle this issue of good guys versus bad guys readings of Matthew for ministry to the young, service to the young, shaping of the young among us. So that's where we're going here. First of all, we're moving deeper into the narrative. You're going to find that, as I've kind of signaled in the orientation video for the whole course, we're going to try to read this narrative as a narrative, meaning we're going to take the scenes in all of their intricacy and the relationships to one another as crucial for making sense of what Matthew is saying. You can't make sense of one scene in Matthew very well apart from how it's related to the scenes that come before it and after it. It's similar to a film, which is a cultural medium that we're all familiar with just by its popularity in the cultures that we're all part of. And we don't think that it makes much sense to drop in like a parachute into minute 42 of a movie. We intuitively understand that we're going to miss all kinds of things and misunderstand things if we read or make sense of a movie that way. So similarly, as we're reading Matthew, we want to pay attention to how each scene follows upon the ones that have preceded it, how certain themes are developed, how certain characters are developed, what structure there is to the narrative development of the story. And hopefully you'll find that when I'm writing or what I'm giving to you in the form of podcasts, as well as other readings, are helping you to follow that narrative thread and to then use that thread to kind of inform your interpretations of particular scenes, particular moments, particular words that are spoken. I think that you'll find that the interpretations that emerge will be theologically richer, ethically richer, when they're drawing on the riches of the narrative. So that's where we're going this week. You're going to find that in the first response forum for the week, I basically try to identify key moments or features in the narrative segment that we're working through, and invite you with a question that I've asked you about it to kind of dig into the narrative at that point and to see, according to the question that I've asked, how it's developing. And I'm hoping you're going to choose in that first forum response one question from the first part of the narrative of Matthew that we're studying. So just after the genealogy, starting in verse 18 through the end of chapter 2. And then your second question, hopefully from somewhere in Matthew 3 to 4. I think that will just spread your study out a little bit and help you get into each segment or each part of the narrative that we're moving through this week. The second response forum, as is often the case, acquaints you with some secondary literature, shares that with you, things that I've written, an optional podcast again, some other readings that I hope will help you to be able to kind of take a step back, think about the whole of the segment of Matthew that we've studied, perhaps some of the more systematic questions that it has raised for you, and to be able to reflect on those in a way that deals with some of your questions and your concerns and gives you some space to kind of think that out. So that's what we'll be doing this week. And so now I want to move to this fundamental issue. I want to talk a little bit about how the good guys, bad guys way of reading the Bible, reading Matthew, it's reflected in much of the literary and other artistic products of our cultures today, how that approach is something that I want us to resist, and that I want you to consider the story of Matthew resisting. And I want to relate this to the disease of white supremacy, specifically because it turns out that white supremacy has a theological history that builds specifically on this kind of bad guy, good guy distinction. So let me tell you what I mean. And this is going to eventually relate to youth ministry as well. Other ministry, but I'm just thinking about a lot of you working with young people. So I wanted to say a word to you about this. So it turns out that a deep Christian tendency from very early in the history of the church, the Christian tradition, has been to regard the gospel, to regard Jesus as fundamentally a corrective to what was wrong with Judaism. And then to frame our interpretation of a book like Matthew in terms of how Jesus is exposing what's wrong with Jews, often especially Pharisees, and teaching us something better that is the new and improved version of the people of God called the church or Christianity. And that leads to an interpretation of Matthew that builds systematically on the backs of Jews what it means to be Christian, in a way that led to a great deal of violence to Jewish people historically as the Christian movement grew and became less and less Jewish in its character. And as we get into the late medieval period and the beginning of what we think of as, European white colonialism in the Americas, as those Christians called those continents, Asia, Africa. The way that white European Christians understood biblical testimony was primarily as informing who they were as the chosen people of God that had replaced the corrupt Jews, and so were the new, true, spiritual Israel. And that self-understanding in relation to other peoples of the world led to this kind of purity complex, this idealization of political and cultural identity, so that what it meant to be Christian was to belong to the race of people in the world that God had chosen and therefore destined to wield authority over the other peoples of the world. And this is the way that white supremacy, white dominance, this sense that white people from Europe and America are sort of the measure of national identity, the measure of true religious identity, as Christians came to have so much power. And I think what this neglects rather obviously, although painfully, is the way that Matthew is not, in fact, a story of Jesus correcting Judaism or a story of the good guys kind of getting it right and the bad guys getting it wrong. You have to really distort what we find in Matthew to get it to say that kind of thing. And, we're pretty creative, so we can come up with ways to do that, but I want to invite us to resist that. As I said about the genealogy, and as I hope was obvious in our reading in the Old Testament, Israel is not, in fact, a people that can be idealized. It's a messy people that is morally mixed in terms of its quality. It's full of good people and bad people, and you don't stop being the people of God because you're bad. So similarly, in the Gospel of Matthew, the genealogy includes some of the most corrupt kings in Israel's history, and Jesus has not come to forget them or to replace them, but to own them and to own their legacy and to address it in his own life. And over the course of Matthew, the people who ostensibly know Jesus the best, the disciples, these young men end up betraying Jesus, denying Jesus, and deserting Jesus. They're hardly a picture of some ideal Israel or some new, true, and spiritual Israel. They're a failure. And Jesus refuses to forsake them or to abandon them. Just as God had with Israel throughout its past, God does not allow Israel's shortcomings or its unfaithfulness to make God give up on God's people. And Jesus is the same way with his disciples, with the authorities that are clashing with him, with the rest of his generation, and finally with all of his people. And this is, of course, expressed perhaps the most horrifically and powerfully in the way that Jesus dies. He does not mingle his body with the righteous primarily in the way that he dies, but with the unrighteous. He makes the destiny of sinners, the curse, his own. And that is the power of his death, already anticipated in his baptism, when he doesn't pretend to be separate from his people's sins, but owns them as his own and joins in the baptism that is for the forgiveness of sins, inherited patterns of injustice that Jesus also inherits, and that Jesus is engaging in the course of his life, not as someone who pretends to be innocent, but as someone who engages them as a sharer in them. We have some really interesting testimony about this later in the New Testament, where Jesus' sinlessness is not about his being separate from sin, but in the way that he makes the sin of his people his own. That's Paul's teaching in 2 Corinthians 5. So I hope that I'm getting at something here that you see as significant. We need to stop reading Matthew as funding an idealized version of ourselves, or an idealized political identity, an idealized nationalism, an idealized civilization. We want to own the way that we are all a messy people. Our communities are full of good people and bad people. We ourselves all manifest a variety of tendencies. Not all of them are good. And that's precisely how God comes to us and is with us. And our hope for being a people of peace and a people of hospitality lies not in pretending to be righteous and trying to live up to some ideal that we think that we supposedly represent. It lies in our ability to be honest about our sins, to confess them and to engage them with one another. This is precisely how Jesus was powerful for his people in a way that has spread since to many other peoples of the world. God's faithfulness is manifest in his faithfulness to his people when they are unfaithful, not just when they're faithful. And that's the power of God's welcome that we're then called to be witnesses to. What does this mean for white supremacy? Well, it means trying to contest the mythology of white purity, the mythology of white people being sort of the natural heirs of a country or a civilization, and to feel somehow threatened by non-white people who have their own visions and hopes and dreams and pains and complaints. We need to give up on that false ideal, let it go as the idol that it is, and to learn from Matthew and other scriptural witnesses how to be a broken people, an honest people, a people that is mixed biologically, culturally, etc., all the way from our most ancient beginnings. How does this relate to youth ministry? Well, I think that young people inherit from this tradition of Christianity that I want us to question, this false ideal that they don't know is false. It's what adults really want them to be. And we try to paint this beautiful picture of the faith, of the church, of Christianity, in hopes that they will embrace it as their own and make good decisions. And I think we set ourselves and them up for failure when we do that, because they can smell the hypocrisy of the false idealization of ourselves. And so let's try to share with them a more honest story of ourselves, a broken community, one that is trying to be honest about the sins that we have inherited, which are not all the same. They're different depending on our social locations, etc. But to be honest about those and to let their voices and their experiences and their hopes inform the way that we engage the troubled legacy that we have inherited. And perhaps then we can help to set a table that is hospitable to young people, because it invites them as real participants in making our community what it is, and not trying to belong to something that we foist upon them as a false ideal of ourselves, because we don't want to face ourselves as we truly are. There's my brief word for youth ministry. Hope that's helpful, and I hope that Matthew's gospel will teach us this hospitable way of remembering ourselves and hoping for a shared future with others, especially others who are very different from us. Keep in mind that the sordid history of Israel, all of those, bad chapters of its being a stiff-necked people and not trusting God, and then the disciples failing Jesus again and again, not trusting what seems to be right in front of them. This is how Israelite people and the disciples chose to remember themselves for us. They chose not to pass along an idealized story of themselves, but one that even emphasized their shortcomings. I think there's a lot for us to learn from that. It's not about, overly denigrating ourselves and just doing nothing but self-deprecation. Sometimes we do good things, and sometimes people live virtuously and justly, and we should celebrate that. But we want to be careful about the kind of memory of ourselves that we want to pass along to others, because that, I think, is what is so key for the possibility of a shared life. Have a great week too.